Hi, seniors. It's Miss Grody. I'm going to take you very quickly through a poem, Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins, and kind of show you how, when I first start to read a poem, what I look for and what my thought process is while I go through the poem. So, hopefully, this will help you with your own reading of poetry and your own annotations and thinking when you first are introduced to a poem. So in this hyperdoc, we're going to be looking at a poem by Billy Collins. Billy Collins is a former poet laureate for the United States. That's a really big deal. You can look up what that means if you'd like. And Billy Collins has a very dry, witty sense of humor. All of his poems are very relatable, very human. He writes about everyday moments and everyday things. He used to be a teacher, and that will make sense once we read this poem. And I really like him. He's a very accessible poet. What that means is his poetry is good poetry for beginners to look at because it is relatable and easy to understand. So we're going to take a look at this poem, and I'm going to go through my thought process with you. So the first thing we always want to look at when we look at a poem is the title. So in this case, it's called Introduction to Poetry. So right away, the title tells us what this poem is going to be about. It's going to be about poetry and some kind of introduction to it. Okay. It's really important to read the title because it always gives us the information that we need to start reading a poem. So here we go. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Okay, so there's a few things in this poem that right away, the first thing that you need to notice or you need to think about is who is the I in this poem? Who's the I? You always want to try to figure out who the speaker of the poem is and who the audience is. Who are they talking to? So in this case, pretty early on in the poem, I start to figure out that the I is a teacher. The speaker is a teacher, and the them and the they that he's talking about, or she, is the students or are the students. Okay. Now, the one thing to remember about a poem is the speaker is never actually really the poet. You always want to call the speaker or the persona. Okay. Because sometimes poets, just like authors, will take on a character and become a character instead of really being themselves. So you want to remember that with poetry as well. It's no different than reading a story where the speaker is a character. So it's this case too. So this is a teacher. Now that I know that, this poem full of similes and metaphors makes a lot more sense. So now I'm going to go through and look at what the analogies are, what the similes are. So the first one that he says is, I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. So I'm just going to highlight that right there. Hold it up to the light like a color slide. So if you can get this picture in your head, he's comparing a poem to a slide that you're holding up to the light. And what does he mean by that? Well, he wants his students to examine the poem more carefully, right? That's what he's saying by using this simile. We know it's a simile because he used the word like, and similes are comparisons using like or as. So why does a poet use similes and metaphors or comparisons? The reason for that is because the comparison that a poet is using is telling us a little bit more deeply what he means by what he's saying. We talk in similes and metaphors all the time. Every time you make a comparison and just in your everyday conversation, the reason we do that is because we want our audience, we want the other person to understand on a deeper level what we're saying, right? So in this case, what he's saying here, instead of just saying, I want you to look at it closely, that's boring. He's like, I want you to hold it up like a color slide. Look at it, examine it, look at its beauty through the light. Or press an ear against his hive. Okay, now here we have a metaphor, and I'm going to highlight that a different color. Let's highlight that in green. Or press an ear against its hive. So now he's comparing us pressing our ears against a hive, like a beehive, and that's what the poem is to him. So he's like, what does he want us to do by that? Why an ear and a beehive? Because he wants us to listen to all the humming that's going on inside of the poem, all the work that's going on inside of the poem, right? A poem is busy. There's a lot going on into it, and he wants us to listen to that. So look at it and then listen to the poem. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. So here we have another continuation of this comparison. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. Okay, so in this case, the comparison to a mouse to us, a mouse into a poem and watches probe. So when you drop a mouse into a maze, what do? They have to find their way out of it, right? And he wants that for his students as well. He's like, drop a mouse into the poem, watch him probe his way out. Probe your way out of this poem, like explore, go through all the different mazes and figure out how to get to the other side of that. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. So that's an interesting comparison also. So the light switch, if we're talking about the light switch of a poem, he wants us to have that moment where all of a sudden the lights are on and we understand it, right? So look for the light switch and turn that on. I like that analogy, actually. Walk into its room and feel the walls for a light switch. Again, it's something active that we're doing to figure out the meaning of the poem. And once we find that light switch, and we can see everything inside the poem's room, right? I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem. So now the poem's being compared to a lake or an ocean, and he wants us to water ski across that surface. What does he mean by that? Well, in this case, if we're water skiing, we're kind of skimming the top of the ocean, right? We're on top of it. And it's a fun activity. It's an active activity. And so this is where he's getting to that active reading idea again. He wants us to water ski across the surface of a poem. So he wants us to enjoy it, glide over it, look at it, or be involved with it, really. If we're on top of the poem, if we're water skiing across the surface, we're actively on top of it. Waving at the author's name on the shore. I love that line. He's like, it's fun. It's a fun activity to water ski across the poem and wave to the author, right? And then we have a tone shift. And this part is really important because most poems have some kind of a shift, and we always need to look for that. And I'll give you a hint. A shift whenever there's a but. So whenever you see this word but, there is a shift. There is a tone shift. So look for the but. You know how in Finding Nemo, he's like, don't touch the but. In this case, we are looking for the but. If there's a but, there's a shift of tone. And that is a cue to us that something different is coming. A different tone is coming. A different message is coming. So whenever we see that word, that cues us that that's what's going to happen. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. Ugh, harsh. That is a harsh statement. So here we have another metaphor comparing you reading a poem to a torturer that's torturing a confession out of somebody, right? So what's he saying there? He's saying his students, they don't want to do these things. They don't want to look at it closely and listen to everything that's going on and skim across the surface and find that light switch. They just want to know the meaning of it. They want to tie it to a chair with rope and torture the confession out of it. Just tell me what you mean. That's really what he is saying that his students want. they begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Oh, went way too far. So in this little part, again, he's comparing it with the torture, what students to a torturer, and what they do to try to find out what it means. So instead of taking their time, really exploring it, they want to just beat the confession out of them. And so, where the poem starts off, so up here, what I would be typing in my annotations right here, and I'm not going to type out the whole thing, but some things that I would notice is the tone is lighthearted here up at the first part of the poem, right? And it's fun. And the analogies all involve the exploration of the poem and the meaning, poem's meaning. Okay. And then when you get down here, right here, because I noticed the tone shift, this is what I'm going to write here. I'm going to say there's a tone shift here. Tone goes from lighthearted to disappointment, disappointed, right? Students don't want to explore poetry. They just want somebody to tell them what it means. So, this is what I would write in my annotations for this poem. So, the teacher's attitude toward teaching his students poetry is fun, it's lighthearted. He has a goal for them, what he wants them to do, and how he wants them to feel about poetry. And then we have a tone shift, which shifts to the student's point of view and how they feel about poetry and what they want to do. Okay. And so the meaning of this poem, so all of this evidence, again, we're looking for a meaning of the poem, right? That's our ultimate goal here. So by the time we get to the end of this poem, the meaning is really that a teacher's attempt at teaching his students poetry turns into a futile experience for him, a useless experience for him. Okay, so that is really the meaning of the poem. That's the theme of this poem, and that's where we're trying to go. So, just like the short stories that we were reading, what you want to do is look at all of the evidence and then think about all of the possible meanings that that evidence creates. And that's what we're doing with the poetry. Okay, so I hope this helped you in your future explanation of, in your future reading of the poems. There are a few more poems after this video to explore and then to write about. So have fun with the rest of the HyperDoc, and I'll talk to you later.